welcome back to another Read Aloud with Miss Disney. I am your lovely host, Miss Disney, and today we are continuing the series of the Villains series written by Serena Valentino, and this is something I'm going to try to do at the end of every book, to where if you are not following along to the chronological order that the author has put, I'm going to try to give out hints on who the next villain is on our little villains quest here. Ooh. So far I have a feeling Maleficent's going to be in here somewhere. I just know it. Well, let me tell you about this next book. Let's just say this villain is not really a villain. It's a classic. Cursed. Beastly. If you guessed it. Yep. We are reading The Beast Within, A Tale of Beauty's Prince. I know what you're thinking. Beast? A villain? Well, if you think about it, the way that he behaved before he became a prince and, well, kind of while he's a beast, it kind of gives him that villain vibe here. But let's see what Serena does in this story, shall we? Enjoy. And chapter 1 is... Hold on. Chapter 1. The Witches in the Rose Garden. The Beast stood in his rose garden, the overwhelming scent of new blossoms making him slightly dizzy. His garden always seemed to have a life of its own, as if the twisting, thorny vines could wrap themselves around his racing heart and put an end to his anxiety. There were times when he wished they would, but now his mind was filled with images of the beautiful young woman inside his castle. Belle, so brave and noble, willing to take her father's place as a prisoner in the castle dungeon. What sort of woman would do that? Give up her life so easily, sacrificing her freedom for her father's? The Beast wondered if he was capable of such a sacrifice. He wondered if he was capable of love. He stood there looking at the view of his castle from the garden. He tried to recall how the castle had looked before the curse. It was different now, menacing and alive. Even the spires of his castle seemed to consciously pierce the sky with a violent fervor. He could only imagine how the place looked from a distance. It was tall and imposing, and perched on the top of the highest mountain in the kingdom, and it appeared as though it were cut from the very mountain itself. Surrounded by a thick green forest filled with dangerous wild creatures. Only since he had been forced to spend his life hidden within its wretched walls and on its grounds, had he done such things as taken his surroundings this way, actually see and indeed feel them. He now contemplated the moonlight casting sinister shadows on the statues that flanked the path leading from the castle to his garden. Large winged creatures more frightening than anything from the ancient stories the tutors of his youth had made him study. He couldn't recall these sculptures being there before the castle and its lands were enchanted. There had been many changes since the witches had brought their enchantments. The topiaries, for example, seemed to snarl at him as he prowled the labyrinth on evenings like this, attempting to take his mind off his troubles. He had long since gotten used to the statue's watching eyes glancing at him when he wasn't looking at them directly, and their slight movements he caught only out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, and had almost gotten used to it. Almost. And the grand entrance of his castle seemed to him like a gaping mouth prepared to devour him. He spent as much time outdoors as possible. The castle felt like a prison, and as large as it was, it confined him, choking the life out of him. Once, when he was still, dare he think it, human, He spent much of his time out of doors, stalking wild beasts in the forest for sport. But when he himself turned into something to be hunted, he shut himself away in those first years, never leaving the West Wing, let alone the castle. Perhaps that was why he now detested being within doors. He had once spent so much time locked away by his own fear. When the castle was first enchanted, he thought that his mind was playing tricks on him, that simply the idea of the curse had driven him mad. But he now knew everything that surrounded him was alive, and he was fearful and any further misdeeds on his part would send him into a frenzy, and his enemies would make him suffer even more for the pain he had caused so many before he became a beast. The physical transformation was only part of the curse. There was much more, and it was far too frightening to think of. Right now, he wanted to think of the only thing that could calm him even slightly. He wanted to think of her, Belle. He looked upon the lake to the right of the garden, the moon creating beautiful silver patterns on the rippling water. Apart from his thoughts of Belle, this was the only tranquility he had been afforded since the curse. He spent many hours here, careful not to catch sight of his own reflection, though sometimes he was tempted. He was fully aware of the revulsion it would bring. He had been almost obsessed with his reflection when the curse began to take hold, and he quite liked the little changes in his appearance at first. The deep lines he mused had made his young face more fearsome to his enemies. But now that the curse had overtaken him completely, he couldn't stand the sight of himself. Every mirror in the castle had been broken or shut away in the West Wing. His terrible deeds were engraved on his face, and that sent a hollow, wretched feeling deep into his gut, sickening him. But enough of that. He had a beautiful woman within his walls. She was a willing captive, someone to talk to, and yet he couldn't even bring himself to face her. Fear. It gripped him again. Would his fear now keep him outside, where once it had shut him in? Fear of going within doors and facing the girl? She was a wise woman. Had she no idea his fate was in her hands? The statues watched, as they always did. When he heard the click of tiny boots on the stone path heading in his direction, disturbing his musings, the odd sisters, Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha, an indistinguishable trio of witches with inky black ringlets, a milky parlor with the texture of bleached driftwood, and red baby doll lips, were standing before him in his rose garden. Their faces were glowing in the moonlight, like those of ghosts with mocking expressions. Their finery glittered like stardust in his dark garden, while the plumage in their hair made their bird-like gestures all the more grotesque. There was a nervousness about them. They were seized by a constant series of little twitches and gestures, as if they were in continuous communication with each other, even when they weren't speaking. They seemed to be taking measure of him. He let them. He stood in silence, as he often did when they came to him, waiting for them to speak. They appeared whenever they pleased, and always without warning. Never mind it was his castle and his gardens. He had long before given up on insisting that they appear at his will. He soon discovered his own desires were of no consequence to them. Their laughs were shrill and seemed to mock the tiny glimmer of hope the witches detected within his dark and lonely heart. Lucinda was the first to speak, as was their custom. He couldn't help being transfixed by her face when she spoke to him. She looked like an odd doll coming come to life. With her porcelain skin and ratty clothes, and her unfaltering monotone voice only made the scene more macabre. So you've captured yourself a pretty little thing at long last. He didn't bother asking how they knew Belle had come to his castle. He had his theories on how they always seemed to know everything about him, but didn't care to share them with the sisters. "We're surprised, Beast," said Martha, her pale blue eyes watery and globe-like. "Yes, surprised," Ruby spat with an eerie wide grin, animating her two red lips morbidly like a dead creature brought to life by evil incantations. "We expected your condition to have progressed by now," said Lucinda, her head cocked slightly to the right while she looked at him. "We dreamed of you running in the wood hunting smaller prey," Ruby continued. "We dreamed of hunters tracking you down." Martha laughed and said, "Hunting you like the beast you are, and mounting your head on the huntsman's tavern wall. Why, you're even wearing clothes, we see. Holding on to the last shred of your humanity, is it?" they said in unison. The beast did nothing to betray his terror. Terror not of the witch's magic, but of his own threatening nature, of which they were reminding him. They were holding a mirror up to the monster within, which was longing to escape. It was a beast that wanted to kill the witches and everything else in its path. He longed to see blood and bones, to taste their flesh. If he tore at their throats with his claws, he never had to listen to their shrill, taunting voices again. Lucinda laughed. "Now that is what we expected of you, beast." And Martha said, "He will never capture Belle's heart, sister, no matter how desperate he is to break the curse. He's too far gone now, I dare say. Perhaps if he showed her how he once looked, she may have pity on him," Ruby said as a maddening cacophony of laughter filled the rose garden. "Okay."